I'm very pleased to say we have another of the people who has widely been cast as a possible successor to the present Commander-in-Chief. Governor Bobby Jindal of Louisiana has served in a number of capacities at both his own state's level, in senior leadership positions prior to the present one, as the Secretary of the State Department of Health and Hospitals. Also went from there to the federal level under George W. Bush as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Has now been elected twice to the governor in Louisiana, and I think by any estimation is a remarkable public servant and human being. He has taken some very, I think, exemplary stands on the subject that we're going to get into in the next block of our program, namely understanding the nature of the jihadist threat that we are confronting and what we had best do about it. But we asked him to speak on whatever subject he'd like, but hopefully we'll address, among other things, this question of what the next Commander-in-Chief, well, for that matter, what this Commander-in-Chief should be doing to restore our military to the kinds of capabilities that the national interests, which have been so well described by previous speakers, require. So with that, please welcome Governor Bobby Jindal of Louisiana.
Thank you. Thank you as well. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you for that very warm reception. Thank you for that generous introduction. Thank you all for coming out on a Saturday afternoon to discuss what I think is an incredibly important topic. You know, I'll start. I spent a lot of time in Iowa in 2012. I was pleased to come here to campaign against President Obama's second term. One of the arguments I made at that time was that, and I said this over and over, and maybe you heard me say it because I said it all over the state and all over the country, I said that he was the worst president we had had since Jimmy Carter. Now, after the re-election, I went back to Washington, D.C., and I gave a speech up there where I apologized to the president. I said I'd been disrespectful. It was wrong for me to insult Jimmy Carter in that way. Now, the reason I say that is that I believe under President Obama, we may have the first president in the White House who does not believe in American exceptionalism. Jimmy Carter believed in American exceptionalism. He was just incompetent, but at least he believed in it. And this is a very dangerous belief. I want to talk to you today about three challenges. First, I do want to talk about the topic that I was introduced about, which is the decline and what we must do to reverse the hollowing out of our military. Secondly, I want to talk about the threat of Iran. And then third, I'm going to close by talking about the threat of radical Islam. But let's start with this idea of American exceptionalism and why we've got to reinvest in our military. When you listen to this president's speeches, when you see his policies, clearly his idea of leading from behind hasn't worked. His idea of America withdrawing from the world stage has not left America or the world safer. The reality is, under this president's leadership, our friends don't trust us, and our enemies don't fear us. Look at how we treat world partners and potential adversaries. So to the Israelis, our closest, most reliable allies in the Middle East, we refuse to stand by them unequivocally when they're threatened by Hamas and Hezbollah and other terrorists. When you hear this president speak, you almost hear the hints of moral equivalence. Both sides need to do something. Both sides need to give up something. Both sides. Well, you know, both sides aren't blowing up innocent civilians and using suicide bombers to threaten each other. But it's not just Israel. Look how he's treated other allies and other potential adversaries. In Iran, they're chanting death to America, death to Israel, and we're on the verge of negotiating a deal to allow them to become a nuclear power. You look at Assad in Syria, this president draws a red line, and then nothing happens when Assad crosses that line. Again and again, our enemies don't fear us, don't respect us. There's a reason that Russia is in the Ukraine and Crimea. I think he looked over in 2009, that failed reset done by Secretary Clinton. He looked at the withdrawal of the interceptors from the Czech Republic and Poland and said, there's no reason to fear this White House. Otherwise, he wouldn't be. We all know he wouldn't be in the Ukraine, he wouldn't be in Crimea if we had a Ronald Reagan or a stronger leader than the current president in the White House. But that leads me to what he is doing to our military. Thank God we still have the finest military in the entire world, and we have the bravest men and women in uniform that run towards danger to protect us. But we owe it to them to give them the resources, the training, and the support they need. I don't ever want our military in a fair fight. I want us to be able to dominate any potential conflict with any potential adversary in the world. But we've got a president, under this president, the federal government is doing more than ever before. Borrowing money from China, growing at a faster rate, spending more than ever before, and yet we are hollowing out our military. Historically, we have spent close to 4% of our GDP on our military, and we're nowhere near that today. And the result is to be we're going to have fewer planes, we're going to have fewer ships, fewer troops, older equipment, less training than at any point in decades. At a time when China is building up their navy, at a time when Russia is reasserting its influence, at a time when Iran is on the march with more influence in Iraq, in Syria, more influence in Yemen, in Lebanon, and in hotspots all around the Middle East. And so the first point I want to make is that peace through strength is not just a slogan. Peace through strength works. Ironically, the best way to avoid war is to prepare for war. Here's something most people don't realize. President Ronald Reagan, who led one of the greatest buildups in our military after the hollowing out after the Vietnam War, actually deployed troops less frequently than his predecessors or his successors. There was a time when America's word meant something, when our allies knew they could stand by us and trust us and depend on us, and when our enemies truly feared and respected us. There are many world capitals that may not be our friends, but truly need America to lead. They understand what our president doesn't seem to understand, that American leadership leads to a more stable and predictable world for all. Now, the reality is this: by our retreating, we're creating a void. That void will be filled, and it won't be to America's benefit. We have seen what has happened before, and when we retreat from the world stage, it ends up costing us immensely in blood, American blood and treasure later. And that's what worries me about what this president is doing. We must never give foreign capitals a veto power over our policy. This president talked as a candidate about being a citizen of the world. I'd rather he just focus on being the president of the United States and protecting our interests. My first point is this: we've got to rebuild the tools of hard and soft power. Now, this doesn't mean we simply give the Pentagon more money without reform. Yes, we can do procurement reform. And yes, we don't need all the civilian contractors. And yes, we can be more efficient, but make no mistake about it. I'm for a smaller federal government. I'm for shrinking the size of our government and shrinking our debt, balancing our budget, not spending more than we take in. And I think this president has gotten our federal government involved in all kinds of things it never should have been doing in the first place. But the Constitution actually tells the federal government, there's one thing the Constitution tells the federal government it must do, and that's to protect the homeland, to protect America. That's got to come first. This isn't the first amongst equals. This is the first obligation of the federal government. We need to fund that and then see what's left over to see what we can do after we do that. And this is a moral obligation not only for us, but our children and grandchildren. So the first point I want to make is this: we must stop the hollowing out of our military. We must reinvest and understand that peace through strength works. That brings me to our second point. And I'm going to talk about the threat of radical Islamic terrorism, but right now, the deal that the president seemingly is bent on making with Iran poses an existential threat not just to Israel and to Europe, but also to the United States. I wish, just for a minute, this president would negotiate. I wish he was as tough on Iran as he is on the United States Senate. But I also wish our Republican majority would stand up to this president. I was proud of Senator Cotton for first originating the letter to Iran that I signed saying that no bad deal will be binding on a future president, especially if it's not a treaty, especially if there's not a two-thirds vote. And I was proud that he voted against this bad bill. Think about the amendments they wouldn't even allow to be debated. Forget to actually vote on it. And the president said he would veto this bill if these amendments were added. So while the president's willing to release 5 Taliban terrorists to get a deserter back, he would not allow an amendment to say, we're not negotiating with Iran until they release all the Americans being held over there. Why not adopt an amendment that says we're not negotiating with Iran until they recognize the right of Israel to exist as a free Jewish state? Why not say we're not negotiating with Iran until they renounce, reject, and cut off all connections to terrorism? And then why not actually get a deal that says it would do what the president actually said it was going to do? He said we were going to stop their enrichment capacity. He didn't say we're going to allow them to keep 5,000 centrifuges originally. They should export all their enriched uranium. We should cut off any path to a plutonium bomb. And finally, and almost most importantly, we need anytime, anywhere inspections so that we can actually ensure they're doing what they said they were going to do. This is a regime that's already cheated on their non-proliferation treaty obligations. This is a regime that's already cheated on past UN resolutions. Why in the world would we now all of a sudden expect them to keep their word? And this is a regime that's already told us. Well, they've already told us we're not going to allow you to inspect our military sites. Now, my favorite amendment that they didn't allow, just because I thought it was clever, was somebody proposed an amendment saying we're going to take the text of what the president actually released as his fact sheet and amend that into the language so that the bill, so all we're going to say is the president actually has to do a deal that does what he says it does. And they threatened to veto the bill even over that. You know, I think unfortunately the path we're on is that Congress will get a signing ceremony and Iran's going to get a nuclear capability. The Senate unfortunately confused oversight with actual and approval with an actual bill that had teeth in it. And this is what worries me about a nuclear-armed Iran. Yes, it's a threat to Israel and Europe and America, but it doesn't end there. A nuclear-armed Iran starts, in my mind, a Middle East nuclear arms race. There's no way that the Sunni countries, including Saudi Arabia and Egypt and eventually Turkey, are going to allow a Shia country like Iran to be the only nuclear power in their neighborhood. There's no way that, I believe the Saudis may already have an option to buy a nuclear capability from the Pakistanis. So you could have multiple countries now in the Middle East with nuclear capabilities because of this bad deal. And I don't think this is accidental. This president has been talking, you remember back in 2009, in his inaugural speech, he talked about unclenching the fist and working with regimes like this. And then in the Green Revolution, he chose to ignore the protesters in the street. And then when Assad had crossed that red line, he wouldn't overthrow Assad, an Iran proxy, by the way. This may even be the reason he's not pushing so hard on Putin, all to accommodate Iran. All because he sees Iran as being a regional player, all because maybe in some circles, they see Iran as being able to play the role that America used to play, allowing America to retreat and create a void in the Middle East. We just saw from this recent summit that the other Middle Eastern players aren't going to sit idly by and allow that to happen. And those countries, our allies, are hungry for American leadership. And if they don't find it in America, they will go elsewhere to find that leadership. So the second thing we've got to do is to reject a bad deal with Iran. I wish this president understood that no deal is better than a bad deal. And I wish that he understood is you never take any options off the table when dealing with America's adversaries and enemies. He's the only commander-in-chief I know who goes and tells the enemy what we won't do. Now, this is a trivial example. I'm not trying to compare foreign policy to parenting, but could you imagine telling your kids ahead of time, now, and I've got young kids, now, son, you need to do your homework. But if you don't do your homework, don't worry. I'm not going to spank you. I'm not going to take away your Xbox. Who does that? He's the only commander-in-chief I know that goes and tells our adversaries what we won't do rather than telling them what we will do. And then finally, that brings me to our third challenge. The challenge that our president dare not even name. The threat of radical Islamic terrorism. Now, this is no longer a theoretical threat. This is not a threat in Iraq and Syria alone, or even in Paris and Australia. As we saw with the episode in Garland, Texas, this is a threat that is here and coming more frequently here to America. I don't know about you, but how many of you were pretty happy that law enforcement official sent those 2 terrorists on to the afterlife? I was pretty happy about that. May have been a nice little reminder that, I don't know about you, but maybe Texas and Louisiana and Iowa aren't the best place to try that kind of foolishness. I don't know about you guys, but in our 3 states, when they talk about gun control, that just means being able to hit your target, being able to hit what you're aiming at. How are we going to defeat this enemy when the president won't even name the enemy? The reality is we have to beat this enemy militarily, diplomatically, but also culturally. We can't beat this enemy unless we recognize and define this enemy. We've got a president who talks about everything but this. This is what I wish our commander-in-chief would say. I wish he would be honest with the American people. I wish he would stand up and demand from Muslim clerics and leaders and others and say this: Islam has got a problem, and they've got an obligation. They mustn't just condemn generic acts of violence. That's not good enough. They must condemn the individual terrorist by name and make it clear these terrorists are not martyrs that are going to go and enjoy a reward in the afterlife. Rather, these terrorists are going to go straight to hell where they belong. The second thing I'd like to hear from the President of the United States, our Commander-in-Chief, is this. I'd like to hear him demand from Muslim leaders and clerics and others that they acknowledge and tolerate and respect the freedoms and rights of those with religious beliefs different from theirs. Now, I gave a speech about this in London this several months ago, this past January. And when you say things like that, you better be ready. The politically correct crowd, they're going to call you anti-Muslim or racist or tell you you've got an outdated mindset. And I'm telling you that's ridiculous. We can't beat this enemy unless we recognize this enemy for what it is. Now, at the same time I say that, we got a President of the United States going to the prayer breakfast and reminding us and criticizing Christianity and reminding us about the Crusades. It's almost like we live in different worlds sometimes when I listen to him speak. Well, I've got a deal for our Commander-in-Chief. If he will do his job, hunt down, kill these terrorists, and protect us from radical Islamic terrorism, I will volunteer to look out for those medieval Christians in case they come back and pose a threat to the United States. I want to close with the following observation because I want to have time for your questions and comments. I've described the challenges that face us. Our need to reinvest in our military, our need to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, and every option needs to be on the table for that. And third and finally, the need to take seriously and to beat this enemy in radical Islamic terrorism. Let me close by telling you that I know in my bones our best days are ahead of us as a country. But it is time for us to reassert our leadership in a very dangerous world. And this world's only becoming more dangerous because of this president's feckless leadership, his inability or unwillingness to lead this great country. But I'll tell you that my parents, my dad used to tell my brother and me, he came to this country over 40 years ago in the search of the American dream. And he's caught and lived that American dream. But he'd tell my brother and me every night to thank God we were blessed to be born in the greatest country in the history of the world, the United States of America. We remain that shining city on the hill that our 40th president reminded us of. It is now our obligation to make sure that our children and grandchildren can say that same prayer. I have no doubt we can beat any enemies, external or internal. But it is not optional for us to win this next election. We must beat Hillary Clinton, not for the sake of the Republican Party, and not even for the sake of the conservative movement, but for the sake of the greatest country in the history of the world, the United States of America. God bless y'all. Thank y'all very much. Thank y'all very, very much. Thank you. Thank y'all. We'd be happy to hear your comments and take your questions.
Thank you for coming, Governor. And you touched on this question already a little bit when you mentioned ISIS and gun control. But two-part question. Do you think that the right to keep and bear arms is actually a natural right that pre-exists in the Constitution? And do you think that that right has any relevance to our national security today?
Yes and yes, and let me expand. I'm always guilty of giving very long answers, so I want to give a couple of short answers. So yes and yes, but let me expand on why I think that both those things are right. Absolutely, our right to bear arms predates the Constitution. And you know what? So does our religious liberty rights. So does our rights to freedom of speech. The reason I say that, the Founding Fathers understood something that the modern left does not. Our rights aren't created by government. As great as the Constitution is, as great as that generation was, they identified that government was there to secure our God-given rights. God gives us these rights, not any government. Absolutely, the right to bear arms is an intrinsic part of our right. Yes, it's important if you're a hunter like I am, but it's also a part of personal safety as well. And you know, we can certainly have a longer discussion about this, but I'll tell you this. I'll just tell you my own state. I'll tell you my own experience. After Katrina, and I hope that kind of tragedy doesn't befall any other community or any other state, but it was a time where you couldn't call 911 because our first responders were so overwhelmed and so stressed. They were doing everything they could to save lives. And it just was a chaotic time. And I can't tell you how many people came up to me and said it was important that I was able to protect my own family, my own property, because I love the first responders, I love the emergency personnel, but they just couldn't be on every corner and every place. And you saw the TV images. Vast majority of people did the right thing, but there were a handful of idiots, of looters and others that took advantage of that situation. Well, I'll tell you a quick funny story about that. We've always, we've had guns in our house, and I like to take my boys. We go duck hunting. That's what we tend to shoot in South Louisiana. My wife, historically, that's never been her thing. That was always kind of, all right, that's what, and back when Katrina happened, we didn't have our boys. Back then. But after Katrina, she became more interested. She goes, having a gun really doesn't do me any good. Having it in the house doesn't do me any good if I don't know how to use it. So I'd really want to go to the firing range, and I want to learn how to use the guns we've got and get some practice. And so she started doing that. And I tell you this, and this is painful for me to admit. Last couple of times we've gone out, there's a firing range in Baton Rouge, we've gone out there. Both times the instructor came back and said, Governor, your wife shoots better than you do. Which, and for all you men out there, the problem is all we men are so stubborn that we all think we know. And the great thing was she was willing to take instruction. So when, if she veers to the left a little bit, she listens to the instructor, he tells her what to do. She hits that target dead on. I told her we didn't need to bring the targets back home. There's no need to have proof of that. So absolutely, yes and yes. The right predates the Constitution. Yes, that Second Amendment right is absolutely critical for self-defense. And I hope we don't have to go through a Katrina to remind folks of that. And I'm really glad in Texas there was an armed law enforcement official that prevented what could have been a massacre. And what prevented could have been an awful, awful incident. And by the way, the terrorists are to blame. We need to be very clear. The terrorists are to blame for what happened. I know there are folks that are trying to say, well, should they or shouldn't they have drawn those cartoons? Freedom of speech, freedom of religious liberty in America, we have those rights whether you offend folks or not. We need to be very clear. The appropriate response, whether you're offended or not, is not violence. So I was very, very happy that the law enforcement official had a gun in that instance.
Any other questions? Governor Jindal?
Great. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you for coming out on a Saturday. Let's recommit to making sure that America continues to be the greatest country in the history of the world. God bless you all, and thank you all very, very much. Thank you.